Welcome to the witching hour, where the night is deep and the shadows whisper secrets meant to stay unheard. Tonight we invite you to settle in, turn down the lights, let the darkness wrap around you, and listen closely. 3 tales await, each more unsettling than the last, creeping into the corners of your mind long after the final word is spoken. But be warned. The things that lurk in these stories may just be listening back. The fire burned bright in the backyard, a beacon in the black rural night. The 6 of them, Matt, Amber, Lisa, Jake, Trevor, and Naomi, were drinking cheap beer, passing a joint, and laughing too loud. The house was isolated, miles from the nearest town, and surrounded by an expanse of thick, tangled woods. They were young, careless. The night was theirs, until she appeared. She came from the dark, like a shadow peeling itself from the trees, her figure hunched, draped in layers of ragged fabric that clung to her like cobwebs. Her face, when the firelight kissed it, was a ruin. Skin like dried leather, eyes sunken into deep sockets, gleaming with something ancient and unknowable. "Holy shit," Amber muttered. Lisa giggled, exhaling a thick cloud of smoke. "Dude, it's a whole-ass crypt keeper." Trevor cupped his hands around his mouth. "You lose your way from the graveyard, Grandma." The laughter came sharp, cutting through the night air. But the old woman did not move. She stood at the edge of the bonfire's glow, her head tilted, watching them, studying them. The laughter faltered. Her gaze was heavy, like cold fingers pressing against their skin. The air smelled strange now, thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic beneath it. Minutes stretched. Then finally she turned. She walked away, not hurried, not shuffling, just gliding into the dark, disappearing into the trees as if she had never been there at all. The group exhaled, sharing uneasy chuckles. "That was creepy as hell," Naomi said, rubbing her arms. "Whatever," Matt scoffed. "Crazy old bat probably lives in the woods. Let's go inside." They left the fire burning and retreated into the house, slamming the door behind them. Inside, the glow of the television filled the living room, chasing away the eerie feeling from outside. A horror movie played, something ridiculous, over-the-top gore. They threw themselves onto the couch, drinking, laughing at the dumb characters making dumb decisions. Lisa sat up suddenly. "I'm starving. I'm getting DoorDash." She ordered Chinese. They settled in, waiting, the eerie encounter with the old woman fading into the back of their minds. The first knock came 30 minutes later. Lisa grinned, stretching. Finally, she opened the door and froze. There was no delivery driver, no food, just the dolls. 6 of them, arranged neatly on the porch. Each doll was an exact replica of them, down to their hair color, their outfits. But they were wrong. Disfigured, twisted mockeries of their forms. Amber's doll had black threads sewn over its eyes. Matt's was missing its arms. Naomi's had its mouth stitched shut. Jake's was wrapped in barbed wire, tiny red stains blooming on its fabric skin. Lisa stared at the one made in her likeness. It had no face, just a smooth, empty void where features should have been. A shudder passed through the group as they slowly stepped onto the porch, staring at the dolls in horrified silence. "What the actual fuck?" Jake whispered. "This is some voodoo shit," Naomi murmured, her face pale. Lisa kicked at one of them. "Who the hell would do this?" "Maybe that old lady," Amber said. "Man, screw that," Matt snapped. "Someone's messing with us." But no one moved to touch the dolls. Instead, they backed away, closing the door. They locked it. They tried to shake it off, but the atmosphere had changed. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. The second knock came 20 minutes later. A voice, calm, familiar, called through the door. "DoorDash." The tension shattered. Lisa groaned. "About damn time." She yanked the door open, and the world collapsed. The old woman stood there, smiling. Her face had changed. The sagging, wrinkled skin now looked stretched, as though something inside her was pressing against it, trying to push through. Her teeth were wrong, long, needle-thin, blackened with decay. Lisa's breath hitched. The woman stepped forward. Behind her, the night moved. Shapes shifted in the darkness. Silhouettes with too many limbs, too many fingers, heads twitching at unnatural angles. Lisa tried to slam the door, but hands, small, dry, skeletal, shot through the gap, gripping the wood, prying it open. And then they came inside. The house warped. The walls shuddered, flesh-colored veins spreading through the drywall. The ceiling pulsed like lungs breathing, damp with something dark and slick. The television flickered, then cut to static, the screen showing brief glimpses of things that should not exist. And then the screaming began. Amber was the first. She was dragged, yanked by invisible hands, her body contorting as she was pulled into the shadows, her face twisted in pain, but no sound came from her stitched-shut mouth. Matt turned to run, but the floorboards split open beneath him. Hands shot out, wrapping around his legs, dragging him down into blackness. Trevor backed against the wall, gasping for breath, only for his reflection in the TV screen to grin at him, step forward, and pull him in. Lisa and Jake clung to each other, watching in horror as the old woman walked toward them. She lifted her hands. The dolls were in her grip, their bodies convulsed. Lisa screamed as her arms twisted backward, bones snapping like wet branches. Jake choked, his throat caving in, mirroring the doll with the barbed wire. The last thing Lisa saw before everything went dark was the old woman's smile growing wider, splitting her face in two. The house sat silent. The bonfire outside had long since died. A knock came at the door. A delivery driver in a red jacket frowned, holding a bag of cold, untouched Chinese food. He knocked again. No answer. From inside, beyond the door, came a voice. "Come in." The driver hesitated. He reached for the knob and twisted it open. Helen Myers first noticed the man a month ago. It was always at night. He lived in the brownstone across the street, a few doors down, yet she had never seen him in the daylight. That was the first thing that struck her as strange. The second thing was that he always seemed to be watching her, not in a leering, overtly threatening way. No, his gaze was patient, waiting. He stood on his stoop, just outside the porch light's glow, half in shadow. Other times, she spotted him through her blinds, lingering across the street, the dim street lamp outlining his tall, thin frame. It was the stillness that unsettled her. People move. They shift weight from foot to foot, scratch an itch, glance at their phone. He didn't. At first, she chalked it up to paranoia. Living alone in a big city will do that to you. But then she started keeping track. She never saw him during the day. His lights never turned on until sundown, and there were no grocery deliveries, no signs of food consumption at all. That's when she started researching vampires. It was just a joke at first, a silly Google search at midnight when she couldn't sleep. But the more she read, the more it burrowed into her brain like a splinter, only active at night. An unnatural stillness, an air of quiet menace. She began to test her theory. One evening she stood outside at dusk and watched his windows. Just before the sun dipped below the skyline, A light flickered on behind his curtains. She shuddered and hurried inside. The knocking started a week later. It was soft, gentle. The first time, she ignored it. Probably a delivery mistake. The second time, she tiptoed to the peephole and found nothing but darkness beyond her door. The third time, she called the super, who found no one outside. Then last night, she peeked through the blinds and saw him, standing across the street, watching. Tonight, the knocking came again. It was nearly midnight. Helen sat frozen on her couch, gripping a cup of tea, gone cold. The sound was polite, unhurried. She rose slowly and moved toward the door, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She pressed her eye to the peephole. He stood there, pale, gaunt, dressed in a dark coat, despite the warm weather. Helen. Her breath hitched. He said her name, not miss, not ma'am, Helen. May I come in? She bit her lip, pulse hammering. Every instinct screamed at her to slam the deadbolt, to run back to the safety of her bedroom, but she had questions, and part of her, the reckless part, wanted answers. Why? She whispered through the door. I think you already know. She shuddered. You need to invite me inside. He continued. His voice was smooth, a quiet melody of persuasion. That's how it works. You've been reading, haven't you? Her stomach lurched. She felt exposed, like he had reached into her head and plucked the thoughts out one by one. Go away, she said, her voice hoarse. He sighed. You know they say curiosity killed the cat. She braced her hand against the door, heart pounding, and satisfaction brought it back. A chuckle, dark and amused. Indeed, but I'm afraid, Helen, that satisfaction is not what you'll find with me. She squeezed her eyes shut, fingers trembling over the lock. Then, silence. Minutes passed before she dared to look. When she finally peered out, he was gone. The street was empty, the brownstone dark. She barely slept that night. Morning brought the first sense of relief she'd felt in weeks. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes floating in the air. She almost convinced herself it had been a dream, a feverish hallucination brought on by too many horror movies and too little sleep. Then she saw the envelope. It was slipped under her door, heavy parchment, her name written in elegant, curling script. With shaking hands, she picked it up and flipped it over. The back was sealed with wax, an ornate insignia pressed into the red blob. Helen swallowed hard. She hadn't invited him in. She knew that, but something told her she'd already let him inside in the way that mattered most, the way that meant she'd never truly be safe again. Her fingers curled around the envelope. Dread settled deep in her bones. Some doors, once opened, can never be shut. Danielle always liked the solitude of camping alone. It was peaceful, she told people. No distractions, no small talk, just the sound of the wind through the trees, the soft lap of water against the shore. This time, she had picked a remote spot near the Pine Barrens. No nearby campers, no trails, just her tent, a crackling fire, and a weekend of quiet. She had parked at a gravel pull-off near an old ranger station, the building abandoned and sun-bleached, its windows dark and empty. The trail leading into the woods was overgrown, which suited her just fine. She liked the feeling of stepping into an untouched place. She liked the isolation. As she hiked deeper, the trees thickened, the air cooling with their shade. The sun was beginning its slow descent. By the time she reached the spot she had picked out weeks ago, a small clearing beside a creek, the water shallow and full of smooth gray stones. She pitched her tent quickly, set up a small ring of stones for a fire, and stretched out, arms behind her head, staring at the sky as it darkened into twilight. She ate a simple meal, trail mix and a protein bar, then sat with a thermos of tea, watching the fire flicker. The first night was fine. She read by lantern light and listened to a true crime podcast before falling asleep. At some point in the night, she woke to absolute silence, the kind that presses against your ears, makes you hold your breath. Then she heard it, a shuffle outside the tent. She told herself it was an animal, a fox maybe, but something about the weight of the steps made her uneasy, slow, deliberate. Then they stopped. Danielle stayed perfectly still. She listened to her own breath, to the distant hoot of an owl, and just as she was about to close her eyes, a single, long breath. Right outside the tent, her stomach clenched. She forced herself to stay still, not even daring to shift inside her sleeping bag. The breath came again, low, close, a sound that wasn't quite human. Minutes passed, then an hour, then nothing. She barely slept, flinching at every small noise in the dark. At dawn, she unzipped her tent and crept outside, muscles tense. Everything looked the same trees, the same creek, the same morning dew on the grass, until she saw the footprints in the dirt, too large for an animal, barefoot, leading away into the woods. A chill climbed her spine. She nearly packed up right then, but something in her told her she was overreacting. Maybe it had been the wind. Maybe the prints were old. That night she built a larger fire, letting the crackling flames reassure her. She kept her hunting knife within reach, but sleep did not come easy. Then at 3:13 a.m., it came again, scraping, something dragging its fingers along the nylon of the tent. She swallowed her breath, pressing a hand over her mouth. The scraping circled her tent, slowly, one full lap, then another. She didn't move, didn't breathe, and then something pressed against the fabric, just above her head. It lingered. A shadow loomed through the thin material, tall and wrongly shaped. Not an animal, not a man, something else. Then, in a voice like wind through dead leaves, it whispered, "You shouldn't have come alone." Danielle's body turned to ice. She wanted to scream, run, do anything, but she couldn't. She stayed frozen in her sleeping bag, gripping the knife so tight her fingers ached. Minutes passed, then an hour. She lost track of time. The shadow didn't move. Then just before dawn, it stepped away. By sunrise, she broke camp in a frenzy, stuffing her gear into her pack, heart hammering with every snapped twig. She hiked fast back toward her car, eyes darting into the woods. Halfway there, she saw it, a figure standing between the trees, tall, gaunt, watching. She couldn't make out its face, but she knew it was staring at her. She ran, didn't stop, didn't look back. When she finally reached her car, hands fumbling with her keys, she threw herself inside, locking the doors. She exhaled, gasping, trying to convince herself she was safe. Then she glanced in the rearview mirror. A handprint was smeared on the fogged-up glass of the back window. She never went camping alone again. Evelyn had been looking for a fresh start, a place where she could breathe again, after the chaos of her last relationship and the suffocating weight of city life. She needed solitude. The rental home in rural Wisconsin was perfect, cheap, secluded, and nestled among towering pines that swallowed the house in their ancient embrace. The house was old but sturdy, a relic from the 1950s with creaky hardwood floors and a basement that smelled of damp earth. It had been vacant for years before she moved in. The landlord, a quiet man with pale, watery eyes, had barely spoken as she signed the lease, only warning her that cell service was unreliable and that the power lines tended to flicker in the winter. Evelyn didn't mind. She wanted the quiet, needed it. But the quiet came with something else, something she couldn't quite name. It started on a cold Tuesday morning. When she stepped onto the porch to grab the mail, a folded piece of paper was wedged between two bills. No stamp, no return address. Just a few words scrawled in jagged, frantic script. "I see you." Evelyn frowned, turning it over in her hands. A prank? A mistake? She tossed it in the trash, shaking off the unease curling in her gut. That night she woke to a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, a whispering murmur just outside her bedroom window. She lay frozen, her breath trapped in her chest, listening. The wind, she told herself, just the wind. 2 days later, another letter arrived. "I hear you breathing." Her hands trembled as she crumpled the paper. She locked her doors, checked the windows, made sure the curtains were drawn tight. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, like an insect crawling along the back of her neck. Then came the packages. The first was a porcelain doll with wide, staring eyes. It sat in a plain cardboard box on her porch, its face eerily expressionless. Evelyn's stomach had twisted. She dumped it in the garbage. The second was a withered rose, bound in black twine. The third, a lock of blonde hair, pressed between two sheets of wax paper. Evelyn's hair was blonde. She asked the nearest neighbor, a farmer named Carl, if he had seen anything. He shook his head, eyes wary. "Could be kids," he said, "or something worse." That night, Evelyn installed a doorbell camera, motion-activated lights, anything to feel safer. But when she checked the footage the next morning, it showed nothing, just the empty porch, as though the packages had appeared out of thin air. The letters didn't stop. The walls aren't thick enough. It's warm inside. One night, while washing dishes, the doorbell rang. Her stomach twisted. She grabbed her phone, pulled up the camera feed. No one was there. The next morning, smeared across the glass of her back door, was a child-sized handprint in something dark, something red. That night, she double-checked the locks and curled up in bed, exhaustion pressing down on her. Sleep came in fits. At some point in the dead of night, her phone rang. The screen showed an unfamiliar number. She hesitated, answered. Silence. She held her breath, waiting. "Who is this?" she whispered. Nothing. She hung up. Shortly thereafter, she received a text message. "Have you checked the basement?" She was paralyzed with fear, but she dialed the number back. A phone rang, somewhere in the house. The basement. The one she never used. The one with the bolted door. The phone rang again, closer, and this time another sound joined it. Footsteps, slowly coming up the basement stairs. 1 step, 2, 3. A shuddering inhale, wet and rattling, drifted up through the cracks in the floorboards. Evelyn bolted. She grabbed her car keys and sprinted to the front door, but her hands fumbled at the lock, slick with sweat. Another step, another. She turned, just for a second, and saw the basement door, now open by an inch. Darkness beyond. A shape behind it. The door creaked wider. A hand gripped the frame. Too long, too many joints. The skin stretched taut like leather. The dim light caught something else. Teeth. Rows of them, gleaming in the black. Her phone buzzed in her hand as she bolted through the front door to her car. A text message. "You left the basement door open." She turned back. The front door was wide open, and something was standing in the doorway. The house went dark.